Tormented Souls is a game that wears its inspirations on its sleeve. Look, a typewriter. Oh wow, you need to use an item to save? Time to go to this rusty, putrid hell version of where you already were. You can even use tank controls if you want. Even the truly stellar voice acting is an homage to the classic Resident Evil.
A person in a wheelchair with knives in his hands was chasing me.
Oh, it's you. Don't you remember me? I'm the town priest. We met here in the chapel only a couple of days ago.
The final optional key item you can get in the game is even the legendary Resident Evil bolt cutters. This game is an absolute love letter to classic Silent Hill and especially Resident Evil. But the question is, does it live up to the quality of the games that inspired it? The premise of the story is that Caroline Walker receives a strange photograph of twin girls and feels compelled to go to the Wildberger Hospital to find out what happened to them. And, by the way, the name Wildberger Hospital could have definitely used some workshopping because that does not flow like Spencer Mansion. Anyway, the original hospital burnt down, so this mansion was repurposed to be a hospital in much the same way that the police station in RE2 was a repurposed museum. Almost immediately, Caroline gets attacked from behind, has her eyes removed, and gets intubated, and it becomes extremely clear that there's some bad shit going down here. The story primarily is told through journal entries left by the Wildberger family and residents of the hospital, but there are occasional cutscenes that Caroline will also narrate after you save sometimes, though I did notice multiple times that her narrations seemed to serve as hints for puzzles I had already solved or tasks I had already done. I'm sure some people will have a hard time taking the story seriously due to the cringy voice acting, but for me, it was just endearing and made me smile almost every time there was a conversation. Overall, the story isn't anything too crazy, and most of the story beats you'll predict hours before they come to pass, but you may still be surprised by a few of the directions it goes, and the way to unlock the best ending winds up being really clever. The combat is literally just exactly classic Resident Evil. If you like that, you'll like this. If you know the ins and outs of that, they all work here. If you want to know if an enemy is nearby, you can aim your gun to see if it auto-aims to them. If you knock an enemy down, you can smack them 100 times with your melee weapon to save ammo. If you need to reload, you can do it in the menu so you don't have to wait for the animation. In terms of innovation, there's really not much here, but it's a formula that works fine. There is a small dodge ability that works reasonably well, and I found myself using it pretty often. The only real combat innovation that the game has is that your character can't survive in darkness, so you have to have the lighter equipped and therefore can't use weapons if you're in the dark, forcing you to find an area that's lit or to find a light to turn on before you can fight monsters. They don't overuse this, but it's a nice little mechanic that makes the enemies still threatening and scary for a little bit longer than they might have been if you could just attack them from wherever from the start. Oh, also, did I mention that the main weapon in this game is a...
Nail gun! Hey Sam, let me shoot an apple off your head.
I don't have an apple on my head.
Nail gun!
Healing items and ammo are plentiful, and though I was pretty conservative with my item usage and explored thoroughly, I never came remotely close to running out, save for the very beginning of the game. So even if you're a little wasteful, it shouldn't be a problem. The game starts out a little stingy on tapes, which are the ink ribbon equivalent, which serve to make the combat a bit more tense at the start due to fear of losing progress, but even the tapes start flowing pretty fast, allowing you to eventually save whenever you want to. My only complaints about the combat would be that the game is somewhat lacking in enemy variety and there's only 4 weapons in total, though they do all serve different enough purposes that you will most likely wind up strategizing within each a bit. The combat is serviceable, but let's be honest, the main appeal of classic survival horror is the exploration and puzzle solving, as the games are ultimately effectively point-and-click adventure games with scary monsters, where one of your rewards for exploring thoroughly is ammo and healing items. And exploring the Wildberger Hospital is a real treat. In my opinion, classic Resident Evil games are always at their best when you're exploring a creepy, grandiose building with bizarre puzzles and
Weird fucking doors.
And fortunately, Tormented Souls spends the vast majority of the game in the mansion/hospital itself. There's a lot of really silly ways that things are blocked off in the hospital at first, but as you get further, you'll have more options for navigating through, and everything ultimately winds up being pretty well interconnected, making it easy to get around. The map system is slightly unique in that instead of it being a dynamically updating map, it's just a set of files like any other journal entry in the game that you have to manually go to the relevant page. It can be a little cumbersome, but Overall, it's just one of the nice ways that the game doesn't hold your hand too much, and the maps actually contain a lot of helpful information that's easy to overlook. One cool innovation about the game is the way you interact with inventory items and environmental objects. In Resident Evil, normally all you have to do is examine something once if there's some way to manipulate it, like opening a package in your inventory or being prompted to use an item on an object. But here you get to move your cursor and select all parts of it, or you can manipulate your items in more ways than one. For example, in the first puzzle in the game, you can change the tightness of the wrench to multiple levels and have to set it to the right size. Or, for this creepy washing machine, there's all sorts of shit to mess with. This system winds up making the puzzles really engaging. And if there's one thing above all else that's fantastic about this game, it's the puzzles. These puzzles do not mess around. You will almost certainly get stuck at one point or another for several minutes trying to figure some of these out, but they rarely feel like bullshit and almost always leave you extremely satisfied for solving them. So many times I would solve a puzzle and afterwards take a minute to sit there and think, wow, that was really clever. The number one reason to play this game is if you're a fan of puzzles. When you encounter a puzzle, you almost always already have everything you need to solve it, or the items you need are generally relatively nearby. There were a few times where I gave up on a puzzle thinking, surely I'm missing something, like an item or a piece of information, so I explored more, came up empty, and then racked my mind and figured it out after realizing that they just don't give you that many hints, and they expect you to do the heavy lifting. I don't want to spoil any of the puzzles too much, but there are so many unique and clever ideas that really surprised me, including a few that I've only seen similar puzzles to once or twice ever in other games. If you like games like Professor Layton, Return of the Obra Dinn, or the Payne Street Killings, you'll enjoy what this game has to offer. If I had to make any complaints about the puzzles, I would say that a number of them do require some real-world knowledge, most of which will be basic things that almost everyone would know, like the date of Christmas, what the infinity symbol looks like, or the phrase, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. But one that took me a while to figure out was the fact that I don't really know how floppy disks work, and there's a puzzle that involves knowledge of that being important. There's also an audio puzzle where the solution is extremely obvious, but you have to replicate tones in an order. For some people, I'm sure this is easy, but for me, I've never been able to do this at all. I remember the original Xenosaga had an identical puzzle, and in both cases, I ultimately had to look it up because I just was physically incapable of doing it despite knowing how the solution worked. So, I think there's definitely no shame in looking up puzzles in this game if you find yourself becoming too frustrated, because they cover a wide array of things and some are very challenging. I would say about half of the puzzles in this game appear to have a simple solution and then, wrong. There's actually another level or angle to them to consider that recontextualizes how you look at it, which then makes it so rewarding when you do figure it out. As for how scary this game is, I'd say it's scarier than your average horror game, but nothing crazy. It has its fair share of startling moments or mild jump scares, but the music and sound design actually does a lot of heavy lifting for making a lot of the environments extremely unnerving and genuinely haunting. On the flip side, the music for safe areas manages to create a nice contrast where you can relax for a few minutes before returning to the darker parts of the hospital. The visuals in the game are really quite impressive for a small studio, both managing to have a handful of impressive environments, as well as many with really creepy aesthetics. I do think the character and even monster models do slightly clash with the environments, but it's easy to overlook. Overall, I definitely felt scared quite a few times in this game, but even if you're relatively faint-hearted, I wouldn't say it's too bad, and if you're a huge puzzle fan but nervous about being scared, I think you should give it a try anyway. Unfortunately, one thing you will certainly encounter in this game is a handful of small bugs and issues. I didn't run into anything substantial or game-breaking, but the frequency of small issues made me wish the game had just slightly more polish, since most of the issues would have been extremely easy fixes. I do think some of this can be explained by the fact that the game was made by a Spanish-speaking company, so it was localized into English rather than being made in English originally. To name a few issues I ran into, there were multiple item or file names labeled dummy, as well as a few cases where something interactable on an object would show no text, and cases where the subtitles for a voice-acted line were different than what was actually said, or in one case where a line was completely missing its voice acting. I did also encounter one situation where an event had stopped occurring, but if I examined the window, it still described it like it was still going on. About half of the physical journal entries are written in Spanish, At first I thought this was an intentional touch, since I first noticed it in a note by Maria Wildberger, and it made me assume she spoke Spanish, but it became clear eventually this was just an oversight. The only bug I ran into that wasn't in some way related to localization was this, which was actually kinda scary.
What the fuck? Oh, because the body, maybe? Wow, I wonder if that would happen again.
Nothing too bad, and it does seem like they're still working on fixing small issues, but it would have been nice to not run into these. So, does the game live up to the standards of classic PS1 and PS2 era Resident Evil and Silent Hill games? Honestly, I would say yeah. I really loved playing through this game, and while I think the combat and story are both weaker than the classics, I think the puzzles overall are substantially better, and the exploration is at least generally on par. If you like PS1 or PS2 era Resident Evil and Silent Hill games and want more content like that, you will thoroughly enjoy this game. If you're looking for innovation or modern design, you won't find too much of anything new here, but what you will find is mostly all done very well. But even more than being a classic survival horror fan, I'd say if you're a fan of puzzles or point-and-click adventure exploration games, then this game is perfect for you.